Somewhere beneath the sand of southeastern Turkey, a stone pillar stands in darkness. It has stood there for nearly 12,000 years. Its surface is carved with the image of a fox mid-stride, frozen in limestone as if caught between one world and the next. No one alive knows who carved it. No one alive knows why it was buried. Dust fills the grooves where fingers once pressed, and the silence around it is so complete you could mistake it for the silence before language itself. Touch that silence. Feel how old it is. Feel how it hums beneath everything you think you know. You are not here by accident. Something brought you to this moment, to this story, to this particular edge of the dark where the known world drops away. Call it curiosity, call it restlessness, or call it what it might actually be, a rhythm older than history, a pulse buried in your bones that remembers what your mind has been taught to forget. You have always sensed it, the feeling that the world is not quite what it appears, that the timeline is too neat, too short, too clean, that somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the ash and the stone and the weight of centuries, there are shadows of something that came before. What if civilization is not a line stretching forward from darkness into light? What if it is a circle? What if humanity has risen before, built before, reached for the stars, before only to fall back into silence again and again each time, forgetting that it ever happened at all? Tonight we walk that circle. We follow the memory where it leads through flood and fire, through ruins that should not exist, a knowledge that arrived without explanation, through the gaps in the record where entire worlds may have vanished without a trace. Stay with me. Let's drift a little deeper. Begin here in the dark. Not the ordinary dark of a room with the curtains drawn, not the shallow dark of a city sky washed pale by streetlight, but the ancient dark, the original dark, the kind that existed before anything had a name. This is the dark that waits at the bottom of the ocean 3 miles beneath the surface of the Atlantic, where the pressure is so immense that sound itself seems to slow down, where the temperature hovers just above freezing, and where the only light comes from the faint bioluminescent pulses of creatures so old they predate every civilization that ever carved its name into stone. Down here the water is not blue. It is blacker black so total that your eyes would never adjust no matter how long you waited, and in that blackness the seafloor stretches out like a landscape from a dream. Vast plains of sediment fine as flour and grey as ash, layered so gently over millions of years that each inch represents 1,000 lifetimes of rain and the slow dissolving of mountains into dust. Feel that stillness. Let it settle over you like the sediment settles over the bones of forgotten ships. Down here, time does not move the way it moves on the surface. There is no urgency, no morning and no evening, only the slow, patient accumulation of what has been layer upon layer, century upon century, each one pressing gently against the one below, compressing it, preserving it, turning memory into stone. This is where the earth keeps its oldest records, not in libraries or archives or digital clouds, but here in the silence, in the cold, dark weight of the deep ocean floor, where nothing is forgotten because nothing is rushed enough to be overlooked. If you could reach down through that sediment, push your hand through the soft grey layers, the way you might push your fingers into wet sand at the edge of a beach, you would be reaching through time itself. The first inch holds the residue of our own century microscopic traces of pollution and plastic. Go deeper and you pass through the age of colonial empires, then the medieval world, then Rome, then Egypt. Each era leaves its mark not in words but in chemistry, in the ratio of certain isotopes, in the concentration of volcanic ash, in the tiny shells of foraminifera whose shapes change with the temperature of the water they lived in. Every century writes a sentence in the language of sediment, and the ocean floor keeps every page. And then somewhere around a meter down you cross a boundary. The sediment changes, the chemistry shifts, the shells become different, fewer, stranger. If you have spent your life learning the language of deep time, you recognize what you're touching. You're touching the edge of the last great catastrophe, the moment roughly 12,000 years ago, when the world as it existed came apart. The glaciers collapsed, the seas rose, the climate lurched from one state to another like a dreamer thrashing between nightmares, and whatever existed on the surface before that moment was swallowed and buried and erased. The sediment does not tell you what was lost. It only tells you that something happened, something enormous, something that left a scar still visible today, still waiting for someone to ask the question the Earth itself cannot answer. What came before? Now. Rise. Rise slowly the way a diver rises to avoid the bends, the way smoke rises from a fire that has been burning so long no one remembers who lit it. Rise through the black water, up past the twilight zone where the last traces of sunlight flicker like candles in a cathedral, up past the thermocline where warm water meets cold, and the temperature shifts so suddenly it feels like crossing a threshold from one world into another, up through the blue that becomes green, and then gold as the surface approaches, and then break through into the open air, into the night. The sky is full of stars. Not the faint scattered stars you see from a city, but the full overwhelming canopy of a sky, untouched by artificial light. The kind of sky your ancestors saw every night for 100,000 years before we erased it with electricity. You float between the ocean and the sky, between the sediment below and the starlight above, and for a moment you feel it. Not a heartbeat. Something slower, deeper, older, the rhythm of the planet itself breathing in and breathing out across millennia glaciers advancing and retreating. Like the chest of a sleeping giant, oceans rising and falling, like the tide of a dream that has been dreaming itself since long before you were born. This is the atmosphere of the story we are about to enter, not the atmosphere of oxygen and nitrogen, but the atmosphere of feeling the particular quality of silence that descends, when you begin to suspect that the world is much older and much stranger than you were taught. It is the silence of a museum after closing time. It is the silence of a forest at 3 a.m. It is the silence of stone. Let that silence hold you. The dark is not empty. It is full, impossibly full-packed with everything that has ever existed and dissolved back into the background hum of the earth. Every civilization that ever rose and fell is in this darkness. Every language spoken and forgotten, every song sung around a fire that has long since gone cold, every prayer offered to gods whose names we no longer remember. They are all here, compressed into the sediment, encoded in the starlight woven into the air you breathe, because the atoms in your lungs were once part of other things, other places, other times. The carbon in your blood was forged in the heart of a dying star. The calcium in your bones once belonged to creatures that walked the earth millions of years before anything resembling a human existed. You're made of ancient materials assembled in a modern pattern, so settle deeper into wherever you are. Let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders the way sediment lifts from the ocean floor in a slow current, drifting, dispersing, dissolving. The night is deep. The water is still. The stars are watching as they have always watched as they watched over civilizations whose names we'll never know, whose monuments now lie beneath the sand or the sea or the ice. Tonight we descend into the deep time of the planet, into places where the evidence has been sleeping for thousands of years, and we ask the question the sediment has been holding in its silence all along. How many times has this happened before? How many worlds have risen from this same dust, reached for the same stars, and fallen back into the same darkness? The ocean floor does not answer. It only holds the question, the way stone holds the memory of the river that carved it, patiently, permanently, without end. Evidence does not shout. That is the first thing you must understand if you want to hear what the earth has been trying to say. Evidence accumulates the way dust accumulates on a shelf no one touches, the way snow accumulates on a field where no one walks, the way grief accumulates in a body that has learned to carry it so quietly that even the person carrying it forgets it is there. Evidence is patient. It does not care whether you believe it. It does not care whether you look for it. It simply exists, layered into the rock and the ice and the ancient mud of riverbeds, waiting with the indifference of geology for someone to finally kneel down, brush away the surface, and read what has always been written there. Tonight we kneel. Tonight we brush away the surface. And what we find beneath it is older and stranger than the story we were told. Start with the ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, scientists have drilled cores of ice that reach more than 2 miles into the frozen sheets that have been building for hundreds of thousands of years. Each layer of ice is a year, preserved the way a page is preserved in a closed book, and trapped within each layer are tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere air that was breathed by creatures that no longer exist, air that drifted over civilizations we've never named. When researchers analyze those bubbles, they can reconstruct the composition of the atmosphere at any point in the past, the concentration of carbon dioxide, of methane, of volcanic sulfur, and what they find is not a smooth and gentle curve, but a jagged line, a record of sudden violent shifts, moments when the climate changed so rapidly that the ice itself seems to stutter as if the planet gasped. One of those gasps occurred roughly 12,800 years ago. The ice cores show a sudden spike in certain chemicals, a sharp drop in temperature, and a layer of unusual particles that do not belong to any ordinary volcanic eruption. This is the boundary of the Younger Dryas, a period when the Earth, which had been warming steadily as the last ice age released its grip, suddenly plunged back into near-glacial cold in what appears to have been a matter of decades. The warming stopped. The ice advanced again. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 7 degrees Celsius, and the world that had been thawing, greening opening itself to new possibilities, slammed shut, like a door blown closed by a wind from nowhere. The ice cores record this. They do not explain it. They simply hold the evidence and wait. But ice is not the only witness. Across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, geologists have found a thin dark layer in the sediment that dates to the same period. This layer is called the Younger Dryas boundary, and it contains things that should not be there. Nanodiamonds, microscopic crystals that form only under conditions of extreme heat and pressure, the kind of conditions created by a cosmic impact or an airburst of extraordinary violence. The layer contains spherules, tiny glassy beads formed when rock is melted and then cooled so rapidly that it solidifies mid-flight, frozen in the shape of its own destruction. And it contains iridium, a rare element far more common in asteroids and comets than in the crust of the Earth. The same element that marks the boundary of the extinction event that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The evidence is not in one place. It is everywhere, scattered across 3 continents like ash from a fire so large it had no center. Then there are the cores pulled from the ocean floor, the same sediment we touched in the last chapter. Marine geologists studying these cores have found evidence of massive freshwater pulses, moments when enormous volumes of glacial meltwater poured into the ocean so quickly that they disrupted the circulation patterns that regulate the planet's climate. One such pulse, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,000 years ago and raised global sea levels by as much as 20 meters in less than 500 years. 20 meters. Imagine the coastline, the harbors and beaches and low-lying cities, and then imagine the ocean rising 65 feet above them in a span of time shorter than the age of most cathedrals. Everything built along those coasts would be gone, not destroyed by violence, but simply swallowed quietly, inevitably, the way the tide swallows a sandcastle built too close to the water's edge. And this was not the only pulse. There were others before and after, each one redrawing the map of the world. The evidence extends beyond chemistry and geology into biology itself. At the end of the last ice age, something killed the megafauna. Not slowly, not gradually, not in the drawn-out decline you would expect from climate change or overhunting, but rapidly, catastrophically across multiple continents in what amounts to a geological instant. Mammoths that had survived dozens of previous climate shifts vanished. Saber-toothed cats that had thrived for millions of years disappeared. Giant ground sloths, dire wolves, short-faced bears, woolly rhinoceroses, entire ecosystems of large animals were erased in a window of time so narrow that the sediment layers recording their presence and their absence are almost touching. Something happened to them. Something happened to the world they lived in. And the evidence written in bone and ash and the chemistry of ancient soil points to an event so severe that it did not merely change the environment but reset it entirely. And then there is the evidence that is harder to measure but no less real, the evidence written in human genes. When geneticists map the diversity of human DNA, they find something unexpected. We are remarkably uniform. far more uniform than a species that has existed for 200,000 years should be. Chimpanzees living in a single forest in Central Africa have more genetic diversity than the entire human race spread across every continent on Earth. The explanation is bottlenecks, moments when the human population crashed so severely that the survivors carried only a fraction of the genetic variation that had existed before. The most dramatic of these bottlenecks occurred around 75,000 years ago when something reduced humanity to as few as 3 to 10,000 individuals. The entire species, every ancestor of every person alive today, could have fit inside a single sports stadium. We almost did not survive, and the evidence of that near extinction is written into every cell of your body, a scar in the code of your DNA, invisible but permanent, carried forward through 3,000 generations like a memory the body refuses to forget. This is what evidence looks like when you learn to see it. It is not a single dramatic revelation. It is not a golden artifact pulled from the sand or a lost city rising from the waves. It is quiet. It is cumulative. It is the slow, patient testimony of ice and sediment and bone and blood, each one saying the same thing in its own language, each one pointing toward the same conclusion. Something happened. Something enormous. Something that the surface world forgot, but the deep world remembers. And the deeper you look, the more you find, because the Earth has been keeping records far longer than we have, and it has never once lost a page. There is a moment in every investigation when the pieces stop fitting. You have been assembling the puzzle, patiently trusting the picture on the box, placing each fragment where it seems to belong, and then you pick up a piece that does not match anything. The colour is wrong. The shape is wrong. It belongs to a different puzzle entirely. One you did not know existed, one that no one told you about. And in that moment, the comfortable certainty you'd been building cracks just slightly, just enough to let the doubt in, and you realise that either the piece is a mistake or the picture on the box is a lie. The anomalies of human history are those pieces. They do not fit the timeline we have been given. They do not match the story of steady linear progress, from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex, from ignorance to knowledge. They sit in the record like splinters in smooth wood, small enough to overlook if you're not paying attention, but sharp enough to draw blood if you press against them. Begin with Göbekli Tepe because it is the anomaly that changed everything. In southeastern Turkey, buried beneath a hillside that local farmers had ploughed for generations, without knowing what lay beneath, archaeologists in the 1990s uncovered a complex of massive stone pillars arranged in precise circles carved with detailed reliefs of animals, abstract symbols and shapes that suggest a cosmology no one has been able to fully decode. The pillars weigh up to 20 tons each. They were quarried from bedrock, transported, erected and carved with a sophistication that implies not just skill but tradition, not just effort but organisation on a scale that requires planning, hierarchy, shared purpose and sustained collective labour over years or decades. And the site is nearly 12,000 years old. That single fact breaks the timeline. 12,000 years ago, according to the conventional model, humans were hunter-gatherers living in small nomadic bands with no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no complex social structures, no capacity for monumental construction. Göbekli Tepe should not exist, and yet it does. It stands there in the bedrock of Anatolia like a question carved in limestone, and the question it asks is simple. What else have we gotten wrong? The anomalies multiply the further you look. At Baalbek in Lebanon, beneath the Roman Temple of Jupiter, there are 3 foundation stones so massive that they defy comprehension. Each one weighs approximately 800 tons. They are fitted together with a precision that leaves no gap between them, no mortar, no adhesive, nothing but the perfect meeting of cut stone against cut stone. The Romans, who were among the greatest engineers the ancient world ever produced, did not claim to have placed those stones. They built their temple on top of them the way you might build a house on a foundation you found already laid, already ancient, already beyond your understanding of how it got there. 800 tons, the largest mobile crane in the modern world, can lift 1,200 tons, but it requires a crew of specialists, weeks of preparation, and a foundation of its own to operate from. How did ancient builders move those stones? The conventional answer is rollers, ramps, and manpower, but no experiment has successfully replicated the movement of a single 800-ton block using those methods. The stone sits there. The explanation does not. Travel to Peru and the anomalies deepen. At Sacsayhuaman, above the city of Cusco, walls made of stones weighing up to 200 tons are fitted together in polygonal joints, so precise that a razor blade cannot be inserted between them. These are not rectangular blocks stacked in rows. They are irregular, multi-angled, each one unique. Each one cut to interlock with its neighbours like the cells of a honeycomb, or the pieces of a puzzle designed by a mind that understood geometry in 3 dimensions, at a level that most modern stonemasons would find extraordinarily difficult to replicate. The Inca who controlled the region when the Spanish arrived told the conquistadors that they had not built Sacsayhuaman. They said it was there when they came built by a race that existed before them by beings they called gods or giants. The Spanish recorded this claim and dismissed it. Modern archaeology attributes the construction to the Inca despite their own insistence otherwise. But the question remains pressed into the joints of those impossible stones like a whisper trapped in rock. If the Inca did not build it, who did? And if they did, why does nothing else in the Inca architectural tradition come close to matching it? Beneath the waves off the coast of Yonaguni, a small island at the southern tip of Japan, divers in the 1980s discovered what appears to be a submerged stone structure. Terraces, steps, flat platforms, right angles. Features that look unmistakably like architecture, like something designed and built, rather than shaped by the random hand of erosion. The structure sits at a depth that would have been dry land during the last ice age when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. If it is natural, it is one of the most extraordinary geological formations ever documented. If it is man-made, it was built more than 10,000 years ago by a culture that should not have existed according to our current understanding of the past. The debate continues, and the structure waits beneath the Pacific with the patience of something that has already outlasted every argument made about it, and will outlast every argument still to come. And then there is the Antikythera mechanism. Pulled from the wreck of a Roman-era ship off the coast of Greece in 1900, a corroded lump of bronze that turned out to be the most sophisticated piece of technology known from the ancient world. When researchers carefully cleaned and scanned it, they found dozens of interlocking gears precisely cut, forming an analog computer capable of predicting the positions of the sun-moon and planets, tracking eclipse cycles and modelling astronomical phenomena with an accuracy that would not be matched for another 1,000 years. It dates to roughly 100 BCE, and nothing in the historical record prepares you for it. There is no developmental sequence, no series of simpler devices leading up to it, no trail of prototypes. It appears fully formed, as if the knowledge required to build it arrived from somewhere else or had been preserved from a time we cannot see. These anomalies do not prove that lost civilizations existed. No single stone, no single mechanism, no single submerged terrace constitutes proof, but taken together they form a pattern, and the pattern is a crack in the wall of the accepted narrative, a fracture that runs from Turkey to Lebanon to Peru to Japan to the bottom of the Aegean Sea. And through that crack, if you're willing to look, you can see something on the other side. Not a clear picture, not a complete answer, but a shadow. The shadow of something that was there before something large enough and sophisticated enough to leave marks in stone that have survived 12,000 years of erosion, submersion and forgetting. The anomalies do not shout. They do not need to. They simply exist the way a fossil exists in a cliff face waiting for the rain to wash away just enough rock to reveal the outline of something that once lived and breathed and walked the earth in a time we have been taught was empty. The crack is there. The shadow is there. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That is the nature of anomalies. They do not go away. They only get louder the longer you ignore them. There is a kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something missing. You have felt it, even if you have never named it. It is the silence of a house, after someone has moved out when the furniture is gone and the walls are bare, but the rooms still hold the shape of the life that was lived there. The faint rectangles on the paint where pictures once hung, the worn patch on the carpet where feet once rested the nail hole in the plaster, that once held something someone loved enough to display. The house is not empty, it is full of absence. And absence has a weight, a texture, a sound of its own that is louder in some ways than any noise the living ever made. The silence we're entering now is like that. It is the silence of the historical record, the vast stretches of time where there should be something, and there is nothing where the evidence should speak, and instead it holds its breath where the story of humanity simply stops, as if someone tore out the pages and left only the binding behind. Consider the timeline as it is conventionally taught. Writing appears around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Agriculture begins roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent and a handful of other locations around the world. Before that, for the better part of 200,000 years, anatomically, modern humans existed on this planet, with the same brains, the same vocal cords, the same capacity for abstract thought and complex language that you and I possess. And according to the record, they did almost nothing. No cities, no monuments, no writing, no agriculture, no metallurgy, no trade networks, no lasting structures of any kind. Just small bands of hunter-gatherers moving across the landscape, making stone tools that change so slowly over tens of thousands of years that the difference between a hand axe from 80,000 years ago and one from 40,000 years ago is barely perceptible. That is the silence. Not the silence of people who could not think or create or dream, but the silence of a record that has been wiped clean, a library where the shelves are bare and no one can tell you whether the books were burned or simply never existed. Ask yourself whether that silence makes sense. You are the descendant of those people. You carry their genes, their neural architecture, their capacity for curiosity and invention. They watched the same stars you watch. They felt the same cold, the same hunger, the same drive to understand the world around them. They loved their children and buried their dead and sat around fires telling stories long into the night. And for 190,000 years, they built nothing that lasted. They discovered nothing worth recording. They never once looked at a river and thought about irrigation, never once looked at a wild grain and thought about planting, never once looked at a cliff face and thought about carving something that would outlast them. The silence asks you to believe that human beings, the most creative and restless species the planet has ever produced, spent 95% of their existence in a state of near-total cultural stasis. And then suddenly in the last 5% they exploded into civilization as if someone had flipped a switch. The conventional explanation for this explosion is environmental. The Ice Age ended, the climate-warmed conditions became favourable for agriculture, and once agriculture began, everything else followed in a cascade of innovation and complexity. And there is truth in that. The end of the Ice Age did create new possibilities, but the explanation has a hole in it large enough to drive a civilization through because the Ice Age was not the first time the climate changed. There have been dozens of warm periods over the last 200,000 years. Interglacials, they are called windows of mild climate, lasting thousands of years when conditions were just as favourable for agriculture as they were 12,000 years ago. And during those earlier windows, according to the record, nothing happened. No agriculture, no cities, no monuments. The same people, the same brains, the same favourable conditions, and yet no civilization. Unless there was, and it was erased. This is what silence sounds like when you listen carefully. It sounds like a question. It sounds like the gap between what we know and what we assume, between the evidence we have and the evidence that should be there but is not. Because the truth is that we are looking for traces of the past in a world that is extraordinarily good at destroying them. Wood rots. Fabric disintegrates. Bone dissolves in acidic soil. Metal corrodes and crumbles into orange dust. Even stone, the most durable material available to any pre-industrial civilization, erodes at a rate that would reduce the sharpest carving to a smooth and featureless lump in 100,000 years. If a civilization existed 50,000 years ago and built its cities from wood and brick and bronze, what would remain today? Nothing. Or next to nothing. A few stone foundations, perhaps buried under meters of sediment, indistinguishable from natural rock formations to anyone who was not specifically looking for them. A few ceramic fragments scattered and worn. a few anomalies in the chemical composition of the soil, and that is assuming the civilization was on dry land when it fell. Remember what the ocean did. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Coastlines retreated by miles, sometimes tens of miles. The continental shelves that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years were swallowed by the rising waters, and with them everything that had been built there. Harbour settlements, fishing villages, trading posts, temples, cities, all of it, now lies beneath the waves, buried under layers of marine sediment invisible to satellite surveys, unreachable by conventional archaeology. We have mapped the surface of Mars with greater resolution than we have mapped the shallow continental shelves of our own planet. We know more about the topography of the Moon than we do about the topography of the land that was above water 15,000 years ago and is now 30 meters beneath the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea. The silence of the record is not proof that nothing existed. It may simply be proof that we have not yet learned where to look, or that the places we need to look are buried under water or ice, or the slow, patient weight of time itself. And there is one more dimension to the silence that is perhaps the most haunting of all. Knowledge itself can vanish without a trace. We think of knowledge as permanent, as something that once discovered can never be truly lost, but history tells a different story. The Library of Alexandria burned, and with it centuries of accumulated learning that existed nowhere else. The Mayan codices were destroyed by Spanish priests, and an entire civilization's written record was reduced to ash in an afternoon. The fall of Rome plunged Europe into centuries of forgetting, during which the ability to build aqueducts, to mix concrete, to perform surgeries that Roman physicians had considered routine was simply lost, not destroyed by violence but dissolved by neglect, each generation knowing a little less than the one before until people forgot they had forgotten. If that can happen in recorded history in a literate civilization with libraries and schools and institutions dedicated to preserving knowledge, imagine what happens when the civilization itself is destroyed, when the survivors are few and scattered and traumatized, when the libraries are underwater and the teachers are dead, and the only record is the fragile thread of memory passed from one frightened mouth to another in the dark. The silence is not empty. It is full of everything we have lost and do not even know we have lost. It is the sound of pages torn from a book we never knew we were writing. And it has been accumulating layer upon layer for longer than we dare to imagine. Close your eyes and let the silence from the last chapter become a doorway. Step through it. Step back, not thousands of years, but tens of thousands, past the birth of agriculture, past the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, past the oldest stone tools we have ever catalogued, into a time so remote that it has no name in any living language, a time that exists only as a faint chemical whisper in the deepest ice cores and the oldest sediment layers, a time the Earth remembers, but humanity does not. You are standing on a coastline that no longer exists. The sea is more than 100 meters lower than it is today, and the land stretches out before you in a direction where the modern map shows only open ocean. This is the continental shelf, exposed and dry, covered in grassland and low forest, crossed by rivers that now flow invisibly along the ocean floor. The air is cooler than you are used to, the sky enormous and clean. And in the distance, moving slowly across the plain, a herd of mammoths pulls at the tall grass with their trunks, their tusks catching the low sun like curved blades of ancient ivory. This is the world before the reset. Not the world of caves and grunting and survival at its most basic, but a world that may have been far richer and far stranger than the one we were taught to imagine. The people who lived here were you, not your distant primitive ancestors, not some lesser version of the human species, but anatomically modern Homo sapiens with the same brain volume, the same neural complexity, the same capacity for language and abstraction and creativity that you carry inside your skull at this very moment. They had been on this planet for over 100,000 years by this point, and the question that haunts every honest archaeologist is, what were they doing all that time? Were they simply wandering, gathering, hunting, surviving, without ambition or curiosity for a span of time that dwarfs the entirety of recorded history? Or were they doing something else, something that left no trace because the traces were destroyed, or because we are looking in the wrong places, or because we do not recognize the evidence when we see it. Imagine a civilization built not of stone but of wood and fibre of materials that the earth reclaims within centuries. Imagine cities along those now vanished coastlines, trading posts at the mouths of rivers that no longer reach the sea, where they once did, temples built from timber and thatch that would rot to nothing within a few generations of abandonment. Imagine a culture that measured its wealth not in monuments, but in knowledge, in the precise understanding of tides and currents and star patterns, and the migration routes of animals' knowledge carried not in books, but in the living memory of trained specialists who passed it down through song and story and ritual, with a fidelity that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Such a civilization would leave almost no archaeological trace. Its cities would dissolve. Its tools, if made from organic materials, would vanish. Its knowledge, stored in human minds rather than on clay tablets, would survive only as long as the chain of transmission remained unbroken. And if that chain were broken by a catastrophe severe enough to kill most of the population, the civilization would simply disappear, as if it had never existed at all. This is not fantasy. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia maintained oral traditions with astonishing accuracy for more than 10,000 years, preserving detailed descriptions of coastlines that were submerged at the end of the Ice Age volcanic eruptions that occurred 30,000 years ago, and the megafauna that once shared their continent. Their knowledge was not written down. It was sung, danced, painted, woven into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that it became inseparable from the culture itself. And it survived across spans of time that make the entire history of Western civilization look like a footnote. If one culture could preserve knowledge for 30,000 years through oral tradition alone, what might others have preserved and lost? What songs were sung along the coastlines that are now underwater? What stories were told around fires on the continental shelves that are now buried beneath 60 meters of ocean? What maps of stars and currents and seasons existed in the minds of people whose descendants would forget everything when the waters came? The forgotten epoch is not a single moment. It is a vast stretch of human experience, tens of thousands of years deep, during which people who were every bit as intelligent and creative as we are lived and loved and built and dreamed, and then lost it all. Not once, but perhaps many times in cycles of creation and destruction that left no written record because writing had not yet been invented, or because the forms of recording that did exist were too fragile to survive. Picture the world 14,000 years ago, just before the catastrophe that would become the Younger Dryas. The Ice Age is ending, the climate is warming. The great ice sheets that had covered much of North America and Northern Europe for tens of thousands of years are retreating, and in their wake, new land is opening up green and fertile and full of possibility. Along the coasts, wherever the continental shelves meet, the receding sea communities are thriving in the rich intertidal zone where freshwater rivers meet saltwater ocean, and the fishing is abundant beyond imagination. These are not primitive camps. These are settled communities with knowledge of the tides, the seasons, the stars, the medicinal properties of plants, the behaviour of animals, the engineering of boats and shelters and fish traps. They have language, they have music, they have stories that stretch back thousands of years into a past that is already ancient to them. And then the sky falls, or the ice collapses, or the ocean surges. The specifics vary depending on which thread of evidence you follow, but the result is the same. The world they knew ends, the coastlines drown, the climate reverses, the megafauna die, the population crashes to a fraction of what it was, scattered bands of survivors huddled in the highlands, carrying what they can in their hands and in their heads, watching the waters rise over the world they built, knowing that everything they were is sinking beneath the waves. Within a generation the ports are gone. Within a century, the stories begin to blur. Within a millennium, the entire epoch has become a myth, a flood story told around a fire by people who no longer remember, that is not a myth at all, but a memory, the last fading echo of a world that was real and full and alive, a world that loved the stars and knew the sea, and built something worth remembering, even if no one remembers what it was. Think of the earth breathing, Not the quick, shallow breath of a living creature, but the deep, slow breath of something so vast that a single inhale takes 10,000 years, and a single exhale takes 10,000 more. The glaciers advance, and that is the inhale, the world contracting the water, locking itself into miles of ice. The sea levels dropping the land, expanding the air, growing cold and dry and thin. The glaciers retreat, and that is the exhale, the world releasing, the ice melting, the water returning to the oceans, the coastlines retreating the air, warming the forests, spreading back across the land like green blood flowing into numb limbs. This is the rhythm we spoke of earlier, the rhythm of the planet, and it has been beating for millions of years long before anything with a human face walked the surface. The resets are not accidents. They are not punishments. They are the breath of the earth, as natural and as inevitable as the turning of the seasons, and just as indifferent to whatever happens to be living on the surface when the exhale comes. The most recent exhale began roughly 15,000 years ago, when the ice age that had gripped the planet for more than 100,000 years finally began to loosen its hold. The great ice sheets that had covered Canada, Scandinavia, and much of northern Europe and Asia started to melt slowly at first, and then with gathering speed pouring unimaginable volumes of fresh water into the oceans. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. The Laurentide ice sheet alone, which covered most of North America, contained enough frozen water to raise global sea levels by more than 70 meters if it all melted at once. It did not melt all at once, but it did not melt gradually either. The melting came in pulses, sudden catastrophic releases of water that geologists call meltwater pulses, events that could raise sea levels by several meters in a single century. Meltwater Pulse 1A, the largest and most dramatic, occurred around 14,000 years ago, and is estimated to have raised global sea levels by as much as 20 meters in fewer than 500 years. That is not a slow, creeping rise. That is a world being redrawn. Imagine what that looked like from the ground. You're living on a coast that your grandparents lived on, that their grandparents lived on, that your people have lived on for longer than anyone can remember. The sea has always been there at that line, predictable, reliable, the foundation of everything you know, and then it begins to move, not dramatically at first, not in a single terrifying wave, but steadily, unmistakably, the waterline creeping higher each year, swallowing the beach, where you dried your nets, flooding the low fields where you grew your grain, lapping at the foundations of structures that had stood for generations. You move back. You rebuild. The water follows. Your children move back further. Their children move further still. And within a few lifetimes, the place where your ancestors built their lives is gone, submerged beneath water so deep that even the memory of it becomes uncertain. A story the elders tell that the young ones half believe a myth about a time when the land was larger and the world was different, and then the waters came and took it all away. But the rising seas were only one part of the reset. The meltwater pouring into the North Atlantic may have disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the vast system of ocean currents that distributes heat around the planet like blood through a body. When that system faltered, the climate did not simply warm. It destabilized. It oscillated wildly between warm and cold, wet and dry, creating conditions that no ecosystem and no human community could predict or prepare for. The younger Dryas, that sudden plunge back into near glacial cold that lasted more than 1,000 years, may have been triggered by exactly this kind of disruption, a massive influx of fresh water shutting down the ocean's circulatory system and plunging the northern hemisphere back into winter, while the rest of the planet reeled from the shock. And if the impact hypothesis is correct, if a comet or its fragments struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere around 12,800 years ago, then the destabilization was compounded by fire, by darkness, by a sky choked with debris that blocked the sun and turned the world cold and strange for generations. This is what a reset looks like. Not a single dramatic event, but a cascade, a series of interconnected catastrophes that feed on each other the way flames feed on dry wood. The ice melts and the seas rise. The seas rise and the currents shift. The currents shift and the climate destabilizes. The climate destabilizes and the ecosystems collapse. The ecosystems collapse and the megafauna die. The megafauna die and the human communities that depended on them starve. An impact from space adds fire and darkness to the equation, and the whole system, already stressed beyond its capacity, to absorb further shocks tips over the edge into a new state, a state so different from what came before that the world on the other side of it is almost unrecognizable. The forests are gone or changed. The animals are gone or changed. The coastlines are redrawn. The rivers flow in new directions. The people who survived the scattered remnants of whatever existed before find themselves in a world they do not know, stripped of the resources and the knowledge and the social structures that had sustained them, starting over with nothing but their hands and the fading memory of what they lost. And yet the Earth does not mourn. The reset is not a tragedy from the planet's perspective. It is a transition, a reorganization, a clearing of the canvas so that new forms can emerge. The same forces that destroyed the old world create the conditions for the new one. The melting ice exposes fresh land. The rising seas create new coastlines, new estuaries, new intertidal zones teeming with life. The climate eventually stabilizes in a new configuration warmer and wetter than before, and the survivors, those stubborn few who made it through the darkness, begin to build again. They plant seeds, they domesticate animals, they gather in larger groups for protection and companionship. They tell stories about the time before the world that was lost the gods who sent the flood or the fire, and those stories become the foundation myths of every civilization that follows, carried forward through the millennia, like seeds in the wind landing in new soil, taking root in new cultures, growing into the myths we still tell today about a world that ended and a world that began again. The earth breathes in, and the world contracts. The earth breathes out, and the world expands, and in the space between the breaths, in the pause where everything is still and uncertain and trembling with possibility, humanity picks itself up from the ashes and starts once more. It has always been this way. The breath does not stop. The cycle does not end. It only turns and turns and turns. The past does not stay in the past. That is the illusion we live under, the comfortable fiction that what happened thousands of years ago is sealed away behind a wall of time irrelevant to the present, disconnected from the body you inhabit and the world you walk through every day. But the truth is that the past echoes. It reverberates through everything, through the calcium in your bones and the iron in your blood, through the shape of the cities you live in, and the prayers you whisper when you're afraid, through the particular way your heart accelerates when the sky darkens suddenly or the ground trembles beneath your feet. The past is not behind you. It is inside you. It is woven into the fabric of your biology, your psychology, your culture, and your architecture. And if you learn to listen for it, you can hear it everywhere, humming just beneath the surface of the modern world, like a frequency too low for the conscious mind to register, but too powerful for the body to ignore. Start with the body itself, because the body remembers what the mind forgets. Your DNA carries the record of every catastrophe your ancestors survived, not as narrative, not as conscious memory, but as pattern, as predisposition, as the particular configuration of genes that was selected for because it kept someone alive when the world fell apart. The population bottlenecks we discussed earlier, the moments when humanity was reduced to a few thousand survivors, those events did not just reduce our numbers. They shaped our genome. They determined which traits would be passed forward and which would be lost forever. The anxiety you feel in open spaces, the unease that settles over you in complete darkness, the way your nervous system jolts awake at a sudden loud noise, even when you know rationally that you are safe. These are not malfunctions. They are echoes, survival responses calibrated by generations of people for whom those responses meant the difference between life and death. Your body is a museum of ancient emergencies, each exhibit still operational, each alarm still wired to go off at the slightest trigger because the body does not know that the catastrophe ended 12,000 years ago. As far as your nervous system is concerned, it could happen again at any moment. And in a sense, it is right. The echoes extend beyond biology into psychology, into the deep structures of the human mind that Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. Every culture on Earth shares certain archetypal images, certain recurring patterns in myth and dream and art that appear independently across civilizations that had no contact with each other. The flood, the fire from heaven, the serpent that encircles the world, the tree of life, The hero who descends into the underworld and returns transformed. The wise teacher who appears after the catastrophe and shows the survivors how to rebuild. These are not coincidences, and they are not simply the products of universal human experiences like birth and death and weather. They are too specific, too consistent, too saturated with the same emotional charge to be explained by common psychology alone. They feel like memories, not individual memories, but species memories. Impressions burned so deeply into the collective human psyche by events of such overwhelming magnitude that they became permanent features of the mental landscape passed down, not through genetics alone, but through the cumulative weight of storytelling across thousands of generations until they became archetypes, symbols so fundamental that every new culture reinvents them without knowing why. And then there is architecture, perhaps the most visible echo of all. When the first civilizations of the post-reset world began to build, they did not start small. They did not build simple shelters and gradually work their way up to monuments. They built Göbekli Tepe, massive stone circles aligned with astronomical precision 12,000 years ago, at the very dawn of what we consider civilization. They built the pyramids of Egypt, structures of such scale and accuracy that modern engineers still debate how they were constructed. They built Baalbek and Sacsayhuaman, and the megalithic temples of Malta, and the stone circles of Britain, each one requiring knowledge of engineering and astronomy, and mathematics that seems to appear fully formed without precursors, without the long, slow developmental arc you would expect if these cultures were truly inventing everything from scratch. The echoes in the stones. The knowledge encoded in those structures did not emerge from nothing. It came from somewhere, carried forward by the survivors of the previous cycle, preserved in myth and ritual and oral tradition, until it could be applied again by hands that may not have fully understood what they were replicating, but followed the instructions faithfully enough to produce results that still astonish us today. The echoes are in our habits too, in the small unconscious rituals of daily life that we perform without questioning their origin. The impulse to stockpile food when the weather turns uncertain, the deep human attachment to fire not just as a source of warmth, but as a symbol of safety of home, of the boundary between the known world and the darkness beyond. The way we gather in circles to tell stories, the way we mark the solstices and equinoxes with celebration and ceremony, the way we build our most important structures to face the rising sun, or align with particular stars. These behaviours are older than any civilization we can name. They reach back into the deep past, into the forgotten epochs, into the time before the reset, when people who are exactly like us performed the same rituals for reasons they understood perfectly, and we have forgotten almost entirely. We do these things because our ancestors did them, and their ancestors did them, and somewhere at the beginning of the chain, someone did them for the first time, because they had just survived the end of the world, and they needed a way to hold on to what mattered. A way to carry the knowledge forward, a way to ensure that even if everything else was lost, the essential human inheritance would survive. You are an echo. That is not a metaphor. It is a biological and cultural and psychological fact. Every cell in your body carries the imprint of catastrophes that happened before recorded history. Every story you respond to, every fear you cannot explain, every moment of awe you feel when you stand before an ancient monument and sense that it is trying to tell you something, all of these are the vibrations of an original event, still travelling through time, still rippling outward through the generations, still shaping who you are and how you see the world in ways you will never fully understand. The past is not gone. It is echoing through you right now in the rhythm of your breath, in the beat of your heart, in the ancient quiet voice at the back of your mind that knows things you were never taught and remembers things you have never seen. Listen to it. It has been trying to reach you for a very long time. There is a moment, usually late at night, usually when the noise of the day has finally stopped and the mind is left alone with itself, when you begin to see it. Not all at once, but gradually the way your eyes adjust to darkness and shapes that were invisible a moment ago begin to emerge from the black, faint at first, uncertain, but growing clearer and more defined the longer you look. You see it in the ice cores and the sediment layers. You see it in the myths that repeat across continents and millennia. You see it in the ruins that should not exist and the silence where civilizations should have left their mark. You see it in your own body, in the survival responses wired into your nervous system, in the archetypal dreams that visit you without invitation. And what you see once you let yourself see it is a pattern, not a line, not the straight upward trajectory of progress that you were taught in school, the comforting story of humanity climbing steadily from darkness into light, from caves to cathedrals to computers, each generation building on the last in an unbroken chain of improvement. What you see is a circle, or more precisely a spiral, turning and returning, rising and falling, reaching and collapsing over and over across spans of time so vast that our recorded history is not even a full turn of the wheel. The ancient world understood this. The Greeks divided time into ages of metal, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each one lesser than the one before, each one ending in destruction, before the cycle began again. The Hindus conceived of time as an endless wheel of yugas, vast epochs spanning millions of years, rotating from a golden age of wisdom and harmony through progressively darker periods until the Kali Yuga, the age of decline and forgetting, runs its course, and the wheel turns back to gold. The Maya tracked cycles within cycles, their long-count calendar measuring periods of creation and destruction, spanning thousands of years, each one ending with the dissolution of the current world and the birth of a new one. The Norse saw Ragnarok not as the end of all things, but as the necessary destruction that precedes renewal, the fire and flood that clear the old world so that the new one can rise from the ashes green and clean and ready to begin again. These were not primitive superstitions. They were observations recorded in the only language available to cultures that did not have spectrometers and ice core drills, but did have something we have largely lost the patience to watch the world across generations, and the humility to recognize that what they were seeing was not chaos but rhythm. Modern science, for all its power, has been slow to recognize the pattern, because modern science is built on the assumption of linearity. We measure progress in straight lines, GDP growth, technological advancement, population increase, and we project those lines forward into the future with the confidence of a species that believes it has finally escaped the cycle. But the data tells a different story. Climate science reveals that the Earth's temperature does not change gradually. It oscillates, driven by Milankovitch cycles in the planet's orbit that produce ice ages and warm periods with a regularity that is almost mechanical. Within those large oscillations, there are smaller ones, rapid climate shifts called Dansgaard-Oeschger events that can change global temperatures by several degrees within a single human lifetime. And within those shifts, there are even smaller perturbations, volcanic winters, solar minimums, drought cycles, each one capable of stressing a civilization to its breaking point if the timing is wrong and the reserves are thin. The historian Arnold Toynbee spent decades studying the rise and fall of civilizations and concluded that they follow a predictable pattern. A civilization emerges in response to a challenge, grows as it successfully meets. The challenge reaches a peak of creative energy and institutional complexity, and then enters a period of breakdown when the institutions that once served it become rigid and unresponsive, and the creative minority that led the civilization is replaced by a dominant minority that rules by force rather than inspiration. The breakdown leads to disintegration, and the civilization collapses, replaced by something new that rises from its ruins and begins the cycle again. Toynbee identified this pattern in every major civilization he studied, from Sumer to Rome to China to the Maya, and he saw no reason to believe that modern Western civilization was exempt. The pattern does not care about technology. It does not care about democracy or nuclear weapons or the internet. It operates at a level deeper than institutions, deeper than ideology, at the level of the relationship between a society and the challenges it faces. And when that relationship breaks down, the civilization falls regardless of how advanced it believes itself to be. The pattern is fractal. It repeats at every scale. Individual human lives follow cycles of growth and decline, energy and exhaustion, creation and dissolution. Ecosystems follow cycles of succession, from bare ground to forest to collapse and back to bare ground again. Stars are born and burn and explode, and the debris forms new stars. Galaxies collide and merge and reform. The universe itself may be cyclical, expanding from a singularity and eventually contracting back into one, only to expand again in an endless rhythm of cosmic breathing. And nested within all of these cycles, riding the surface of the spiral like foam on a wave, is the cycle of human civilization rising and falling in time with the rhythms of the planet that sustains it, subject to the same forces of growth and decay that govern everything else in the natural world, no matter how loudly we insist that we are different, that we are special, that the rules do not apply to us. The pattern is not a prison. That is important to understand. Recognizing the cycle does not mean surrendering to it. The spiral does move even if it circles back on itself. Each turn is not identical to the last. Each civilization that rises from the ashes of the previous one carries something forward, a fragment of knowledge, a memory encoded in myth, a technique preserved in stone, and builds on it, even if it does not know it is doing so. The question is not whether the pattern exists. The evidence for that is overwhelming, written in ice and sediment and bone and the ruins of every empire that ever believed it would last forever. The question is whether we can see the pattern clearly enough to learn from it, whether we can recognize where we are in the cycle and make choices that alter the trajectory, whether we can be the first civilization in the long history of the spiral to look at the wheel and instead of being carried along by it, unconsciously choose to step off it, or at least to slow it down, or at the very least to prepare for the next turn so that when it comes, as it always comes, we lose a little less than the ones who came before us. The pattern is there. It has always been there. The only question is whether we are finally ready to see it. The Earth warns before it resets. It always has. Not in words, not in language. Anything human would recognize as communication, but in signs, in shifts, in the slow accumulation of small changes that only become visible in retrospect, or to those who have learned to read the planet the way a sailor reads the sea, not by studying charts, but by feeling the swell beneath the hull, by tasting the salt in the wind, by watching the birds and knowing from the direction of their flight that something is changing beyond the horizon, even if you cannot yet see what it is. The warnings are always there. The question is whether anyone is paying attention, and the answer across the full sweep of human history is almost never. We see the warnings after the fact. We find them in the ice cores and the sediment layers and the tree rings written in the language of chemistry and isotope ratios, and we say, yes, there it is. The signal was clear, the signs were obvious. How could they have missed it? But they did miss it, and we are missing it now. Consider what the tree rings tell us. In the oldest living trees on Earth, the bristlecone pines of the American Southwest, some of which have been alive for more than 5,000 years, each ring records a year of growth, and the width and density of each ring reflect the conditions of that year, the temperature, the rainfall, the amount of sunlight that reached the canopy. Narrow rings mean cold years, drought years, years when the sun was dimmed by volcanic ash or the climate shifted toward conditions hostile to growth. And when you line up thousands of years of tree ring data, you see the warnings encoded there like a heartbeat on a monitor. You see the spikes and dips that correspond to known volcanic eruptions, to solar minimums, to periods of drought that brought civilizations to their knees, the collapse of the Maya, the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the end of the Bronze Age. All of them are written in the rings, preceded by years or decades of deteriorating conditions that the trees recorded faithfully, even if the people living among them did not notice or did not understand what the narrowing rings meant. The ice tells the same story from a different angle. In the Greenland ice cores, the decades preceding the Younger Dryas show a pattern of increasing instability temperature fluctuations growing wider and more erratic, like the oscillations of a system approaching a tipping point. The climate was not simply warm or cold. It was flickering between states unable to settle, searching for a new equilibrium, and anyone who understood what that flickering meant would have recognized it as a warning that the system was about to shift dramatically. We see the same pattern in the sediment cores from the ocean floor, where the chemical signatures of the centuries preceding major climate events show increasing variability, increasing stress, the kind of noise a system generates when it is being pushed toward a threshold it cannot return from. The warnings are not sudden. They build, they accumulate. They are the planet's way of saying that something is about to change, the way the pressure drops before a storm, the way animals grow restless before an earthquake, the way the sea withdraws from the shore before a tsunami reveals the naked seabed to anyone who knows enough to run. The megafauna knew. There is evidence in the fossil record that animal populations were already under stress before the mass extinctions at the end of the Ice Age. that their ranges were shrinking, their diversity declining, their numbers fluctuating in ways that suggest an ecosystem losing its stability. The mammoths did not simply vanish overnight. They were in decline for centuries, pushed into smaller and smaller territories by changing vegetation patterns and shifting climate zones, weakened by inbreeding as their populations fragmented, and when the final blow came, whether it was an impact or a flood or a cascade of both, they were already too diminished to absorb it. The extinction was not a single event. It was the culmination of a long, slow warning that the world was changing in ways the megafauna could not adapt to quickly enough. The warning was there. The animals could not read it. They could only respond to it with their bodies moving, shrinking, dying one herd at a time until there were no herds left. And now consider the warnings of our own time, because they are everywhere, written in the same language of chemistry and temperature and biological stress that preceded every previous reset. The carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is higher than it has been in at least 800,000 years, and it is rising faster than at any point in the geological record. Global temperatures are increasing at a rate that outpaces anything in the ice core data outside of the most catastrophic events in Earth's history. The oceans are warming, acidifying, losing oxygen, and the marine ecosystems that depend on stable chemical conditions are showing signs of stress that marine biologists describe in terms that echo the language of the fossil record: declining diversity range shifts, population crashes, the slow unravelling of food webs that have been stable for thousands of years. On land, species are going extinct at a rate that some scientists estimate is 1,000 times higher than the natural background rate, a pace of biodiversity loss that has not been seen since the last great mass extinction event. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are losing mass at an accelerating rate, pouring fresh water into the oceans, in a pattern that is uncomfortably reminiscent of the meltwater pulses that disrupted ocean circulation at the end of the last ice age. The warnings are not subtle, they are not hidden. They are written in the atmosphere and the ocean and the ice and the DNA of every species that is struggling to adapt to a world that is changing faster than evolution can respond. The bristlecone pines are recording it in their rings, right now, this very year, this very season, adding another line of data to a record that stretches back millennia. A record that future scientists, if there are future scientists, will examine the way we examine the rings from the centuries before the Bronze Age collapse, and they will see the same pattern we see in every previous warning: the flickering, the instability, the narrowing rings. The system searching for a new equilibrium and not finding one. And they will ask the same question we ask when we look at the warnings that preceded the Younger Dryas or the Toba eruption or the megafauna extinctions. They saw the signs, they had the knowledge, they had the tools to read what the Earth was telling them. Why did they not listen? The Earth is speaking. It is speaking in the language it has always spoken, the language of ice and sediment and tree rings and dying species, the only language it knows, and the message is the same message it has sent before every reset in its long and patient history. Something is changing. The threshold is near. What you do next will determine what survives. Look up. Even if you are indoors, even if the ceiling blocks your view, look up. And remember that beyond the plaster and the wood and the concrete there is a sky. And beyond the sky there is a void so vast that light itself takes billions of years to cross it. And scattered through that void are objects moving at speeds and along trajectories that the human mind can describe mathematically, but cannot truly comprehend. Rocks the size of mountains tumbling silently through the dark. Comets, trailing tails of gas and dust along orbits that take them from the outer reaches of the solar system to within a few million miles of the sun and back again. The remnants of ancient collisions, shattered asteroids, fragments of worlds that never finished forming, drifting in belts and streams and clouds that intersect the path of the Earth with a regularity that is terrifying once you understand it. The sky is not empty, it is a shooting gallery, and the Earth moves through it every day, every hour, every second, protected by nothing but statistics, the comforting probability that on any given day the bullet will miss. But probability is not certainty, and over long enough timescales everything that can happen does. The Earth bears the scars of every time the bullet did not miss. There are more than 190 confirmed impact craters on the planet's surface, and those are only the ones that have survived erosion, tectonic activity, and the slow burial of time. The true number is certainly far higher because most impacts occur in the ocean, which covers 70% of the Earth's surface and swallows the evidence within centuries, and because the oldest craters on land have been ground away by glaciers, or buried under kilometres of sediment, or subducted into the mantle by the restless movement of tectonic plates. The Chicxulub crater in Mexico, buried beneath the Yucatan Peninsula, is the scar left by the asteroid that ended the age of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. It is nearly 150 kilometres across, and the impact that created it released energy equivalent to 10 billion nuclear bombs, triggering earthquakes, tsunamis, wildfires that consumed entire continents, and a global winter that lasted years and killed 75% of all species on Earth. That was not the largest impact in Earth's history. It was simply the most recent one large enough to leave an unmistakable mark in the geological record and reshape the trajectory of life on the planet. But you do not need an extinction-level asteroid to reset a civilization. The Tunguska event of 1908, when a small asteroid or comet fragment exploded in the atmosphere over Siberia, flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest, with a blast equivalent to roughly 15 megatons of TNT, 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. If it had arrived 4 hours later, the rotation of the Earth would have placed a major city beneath it. There was no warning, there was no detection. The object was simply not large enough or bright enough to be seen before it hit. And Tunguska was small, perhaps 50 to 60 meters across a pebble by cosmic standards. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that something much larger, perhaps a fragmented comet several kilometers in total diameter, struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere around 12,800 years ago. And the evidence, the nanodiamonds, the spherules, the iridium layer, the continent-wide wildfire signatures suggests that the devastation was orders of magnitude greater. If that event did occur, it did not merely damage the world, it reset it. And then there is the sun, the star we orbit, the source of all energy on Earth, the engine that drives the climate and the weather, and the photosynthesis that sustains every food chain on the planet. We think of the sun as constant, reliable, the one thing in the sky we can count on, but the sun is a variable star. It pulses with an 11-year cycle of magnetic activity that produces sunspots, solar flares, and coronal mass ejections, bursts of charged particles, and electromagnetic radiation that stream outward through the solar system at millions of miles per hour. Most of them miss the Earth. Most of the ones that hit the Earth are absorbed by the magnetosphere, the invisible shield generated by the planet's molten iron core, and the only visible effect is the aurora, the northern and southern lights dancing in the polar skies. But occasionally a solar storm is powerful enough to overwhelm the magnetosphere, and when that happens, the consequences are severe. The Carrington event of 1859 was the most powerful solar storm in recorded history, and it set telegraph wires on fire-shocked operators at their stations and produced auroras visible in the tropics. If a storm of that magnitude struck today, it would destroy power grids, disable satellites, disrupt communications, and cause trillions of dollars in damage. Recovery would take years, possibly decades. But the Carrington event was not the worst the sun can do. Ice cores and tree rings contain evidence of solar events in the deep past that were far more powerful storms that would make Carrington look like a gentle breeze. And the sun is not the only stellar threat. Gamma ray bursts, the most energetic events in the universe produced by the collapse of massive stars or the collision of neutron stars, can release more energy in a few seconds than the sun will produce in its entire lifetime. If one occurred close enough to Earth, within a few thousand light years, the burst of radiation could strip away the ozone layer and bathe the surface in ultraviolet and cosmic radiation intense enough to sterilize the land and the upper layers of the ocean. There is speculation that a gamma-ray burst may have contributed to one or more of the mass extinctions in Earth's history, though the evidence is circumstantial. The point is that the sky is not passive. It is active, dynamic, and occasionally violent, and the Earth sits within it the way a small boat sits in a large ocean, subject to forces it cannot control and cannot always see coming. The ancient builders understood this relationship between sky and Earth in a way that we have largely forgotten. They aligned their monuments with the stars not out of superstition, but out of vigilance, because they knew, or remembered, or had been told by those who came before that the sky was the source of both life and destruction, that the same sun that warmed the fields could scorch them, that the same stars that guided navigation could rain fire, that the heavens were not a ceiling, but a door, and that what came through it could change everything. Göbekli Tepe is aligned with astronomical events. The pyramids encode the positions of stars. Stonehenge tracks the solstices with a precision that suggests its builders cared deeply about knowing exactly where the sun and moon were at every moment. These were not decorations. They were instruments calibrated across generations designed to watch the sky the way a sentinel watches the horizon, because the people who built them understood something we have allowed ourselves to forget. The relationship between sky and earth is not metaphorical. It is physical, immediate, and consequential, and the next time the sky sends something our way, the only thing that will matter is whether we were watching. You have felt it before. Not as a thought, not as something you could articulate or explain, but as a sensation, a flicker of recognition that passes through you like a cold draught through an open window, brief and unexplained and gone before you can turn to face it. You are standing in a place you have never been, a ruin, perhaps a stretch of coastline, a forest clearing, where the light falls at a certain angle and something inside you shifts. Not memory exactly, because you have no memory of this place, but something older than memory, something that feels like remembering without content, like homesickness for a home you never had. The French call it déjà vu. The psychologists call it a neurological glitch, a misfiring of the temporal lobe that creates a false sense of familiarity. But what if it is neither a glitch nor an illusion? What if it is an echo, a faint signal from the deep past bleeding through the layers of accumulated forgetting, reaching you across the gulf of centuries the way starlight reaches you from stars that may have already died? What if the sense of return is not a trick of the brain, but a recognition your body and your buried inheritance telling you that you have been here before? Not you personally, but the long, unbroken chain of which you are the latest and most temporary link. The return is everywhere once you begin to notice it. It is in the way civilizations rebuild on the same sites, layer upon layer, city upon city, as if certain locations on the Earth's surface exert a gravitational pull on human settlement that transcends any single culture or era. Troy was built and destroyed and rebuilt 9 times over thousands of years, each new city rising on the rubble of the last. Rome was built on older settlements that were built on older settlements, still the layers going down into the earth like pages in a book that no one has read all the way to the beginning. Mexico City sits on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, which sat on the ruins of older cities which may have sat on the ruins of something older, still the pattern repeating so faithfully that it begins to look less like coincidence and more like compulsion, as if humanity is drawn back to the same places by a force it does not understand, rebuilding what was lost without knowing that it is rebuilding, following blueprints encoded not in paper, but in some deeper substrate of cultural memory that survives the collapse of the civilizations that created it. The return is in our technology. We think of our machines and our systems as novel, as inventions without precedent, as proof that we have reached a level of advancement that no previous civilization could have imagined. But look closer, and the patterns repeat. The Romans built networks of roads that connected an empire, standardized their construction, maintained them with dedicated labor, and used them to move goods and information across thousands of miles. We built the internet. The function is identical. The materials are different, but the impulse is the same drive to connect, to communicate, to collapse distance, to bind a civilization together with infrastructure that allows its farthest edges to remain in contact with its center. The Antikythera mechanism was an analog computer that predicted celestial events. Our computers predict weather patterns, model climate systems, track the movements of asteroids. The technology has advanced, but the purpose has not changed. We are still doing what humans have always done, watching the sky, measuring the cycles, trying to predict what comes next. Building tools to extend the reach of our senses into domains our bodies cannot access on their own. The return is in our stories. The myths that every civilization tells are not unique to that civilization. They are retellings Variations on themes so old that their origin cannot be traced, stories that return again and again in new costumes, but with the same skeleton beneath. The hero who descends into darkness and returns with knowledge. The great flood that destroys the world and spares only a few. The tower that reaches toward heaven and is struck down. The golden age that was lost and the promise that it will come again. We tell these stories in novels and films and television series and video games, updating the details for each new generation, and we think we are being creative, original, modern, but we are not. We are remembering. We are performing the same ritual that every post-reset civilization has performed since the first survivors gathered around the first fire after the first catastrophe and tried to make sense of what had happened to them. The stories return because the experiences they encode return. The flood comes again. The fire comes again, the civilization rises and falls and rises again, and each time the survivors tell the same stories because the stories are true, not as literal accounts of specific events, but as maps of the pattern, guides to the cycle, instructions for how to endure the next turn of the wheel. The return is in the way we build our monuments. Every great civilization erects structures that are too large and too permanent for any practical purpose, structures that seem designed not for the present but for the future, as if the builders knew, consciously or unconsciously, that their civilization would not last and they wanted to leave something behind that would. The pyramids, the megaliths, the cathedrals of Europe that took centuries to complete longer than the lifetimes of the people who began them. Our own skyscrapers and dams and space stations, each one a statement of permanence, made by a species that knows in its bones that nothing is permanent. We build these things because we have always built them because the impulse to leave a mark that outlasts the maker is wired into us so deeply that it feels like instinct, and perhaps it is instinct, an instinct forged in the aftermath of resets so devastating that the survivors vowed to leave something behind that the next cycle could find, could read, could use to avoid the same fate. We build monuments the way animals mark territory, not for ourselves, but for whoever comes after a message that says we were here. We existed. We knew things. Do not forget us. Do not make our mistakes. Do not let what we learned disappear into the silence again. And the return is in you in this very moment, in the fact that you are lying here in the dark, listening to a story about the rise and fall of civilizations, feeling something stir inside you that is not quite curiosity and not quite fear, but something in between, something that recognizes the pattern, even as your rational mind insists that it is too large and too strange to be real. You have been here before, not in this room, not in this body, but in this moment, the moment of recognition, the moment when someone pauses in the middle of their life and looks at the ruins and the myths and the stars and feels the weight of the cycle pressing down on them like the weight of sediment on the ocean floor. Every generation has its version of this moment. Every civilization produces people who see the pattern and try to warn the others, and every civilization ignores them until it is too late. The return is not coming. It is already here. It has always been here, woven into the fabric of everything we do and everything we are, patient and persistent and as certain as the tide. The wheel turns, the cycle continues, and we, the latest iteration, the newest chapter, stand at the same crossroads where every previous version of ourselves has stood facing the same choice. Do we see the pattern, or do we look away? Do we remember, or do we forget? Do we prepare, or do we sleepwalk into the next reset the way the mammoths walked into theirs, unaware until the very end that the ground beneath their feet was about to disappear? And so we arrive here, at the place where knowledge becomes something quieter than knowledge, where the weight of everything we have explored tonight begins to settle, not as burden, but as ballast, the kind of weight that does not press you down but holds you steady, the way the keel of a ship holds it upright in deep water, the way the roots of an ancient tree hold it firm against the wind. You have travelled a long way. You have descended to the ocean floor and risen again beneath the stars. You have touched the sediment layers where catastrophes are written in chemistry. You have stood before the anomalies in stone, and felt the crack in the accepted story widen just enough to let the light of older questions shine through. You have listened to the silence where civilization should have spoken, and heard in that silence not emptiness, but fullness, the fullness of everything that was lost and everything that endured despite the losing. Let it rest now. Not because the questions are answered, they are not, they may never be, but because the asking itself has done its work. You know something tonight that you did not know before, or perhaps you have remembered something you always knew, but had buried beneath the noise and speed of a world that does not encourage stillness. You know that the earth is old beyond comprehension, and that it has seen this before the rise and the reach and the fall and the slow beginning again. You know that you are made of the same materials that were here for every previous cycle, the same carbon, the same calcium, the same iron forged in the death of stars, and that those materials do not forget, even when the minds they compose do. You know that the pattern is real, and that you are inside it, not outside looking in, not above it, not exempt from it, but woven into it the way a thread is woven into a cloth so vast that no single thread can see the whole design. And knowing that you can rest, not the rest of someone who has given up, but the rest of someone who has finally stopped fighting the current and learned to float, trusting that the water will hold them, trusting that the rhythm of the planet is not something to resist, but something to listen to the way you listen to your own breathing as you drift towards sleep, each exhale carrying you a little further from the surface, a little deeper into the quiet, a little closer to the place where all the noise dissolves and only the essential remains. The cycle will continue, the earth will breathe in and breathe out, the stars will watch, and you, this particular arrangement of ancient dust and borrowed light, will rest tonight the way the sediment rests on the ocean floor, gently, patiently, without resistance, knowing that whatever comes next, whatever the wheel brings around again, the story does not end. It only turns, and in the turning, there is peace. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The deep water is behind you, now the sediment and the starlight, the ruins and the silence, the long spiral of civilizations rising and falling like breath across millennia. You have walked a great distance tonight, further than miles can measure down through the layers of time itself, and now the walking is done. You do not need to carry any of it with you into sleep. You do not need to remember the names or the dates or the details. The mind will release what it does not need the way the ocean releases the tide, gently, without effort, without loss. What matters has already settled into you, the way sediment settles into the deep places where the current cannot reach. It is there now, below thought, below language, resting in the quiet architecture of your body, where it will remain long after the words have faded. In the end, traveller, it is all right to not understand. It is all right to hold a question without needing an answer, the way the ocean floor holds the imprint of vanished coastlines, without needing to explain them. The mystery is not a problem to be solved. It is a landscape to be inhabited, and you have been inhabiting it tonight with the patience of stone and the stillness of deep water, and that is enough. That has always been enough. Let gravity hold you. Let the questions fade. Let your body remember what it has always known, that it is made of old materials, that it belongs to the earth, that the same forces that shaped the mountains and carved the rivers are holding you now, pressing you gently into the dark, the way the planet presses the sediment into the seafloor, slowly, tenderly, without judgment. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight the universe whispers again, sleep, traveller, the cosmos will keep watch.